These color bars are provided as a reference for you to adjust your playback system, ensuring maximum picture quality. Please adjust your sets now. Controlling contrast in black and white photography will be the focus of this volume of the Classroom Collection. We will explore a variety of techniques available in reducing and increasing contrast.
We're at the Greek Orthodox Church in Santa Barbara, California. We're here to do some film testing. We're going to test black and white materials for standardization. We've picked a subject, this bright white building, white adobe structure in sunlight, and we're going to set up a shot using some deep shadow, which is going to represent the extreme ranges of contrast we could expect to see in a normal daylight situation. This is going to be a good situation for testing. We're going to expose 3 rolls of T-Max 100 film. We've chosen T-Max 100 for our film test today because it's a fine-grain, extremely fine-grain film that's excellent for use in small format cameras, particularly when you want to do extreme enlargements for landscape photography or the kind of photography here of this building where we might want to make an 11 by 14 or larger print. This is a good choice of a material. We're going to do an exposure variation of 5 stops. And what we're going to do is rate the film at ISO 100. We're going to take and expose 1 normal frame. Then we're going to overexpose by 1 stop, overexpose by 2 stops. We're going to underexpose by 1 stop and underexpose by 2 stops. So we'll wind up having 5 separate exposures. Once we've done that, we're going to repeat it over and over again until we've shot 1 entire roll. Then we'll take a second roll and a third roll and do the same exposure, that 5-stop increment over and over until we've used that roll of film. When we get to the lab, we're going to process each roll of film differently. The first roll of film we'll process normally as per the manufacturer's recommendations. The second roll of film, we're going to do something we call push processing, which means that we're going to overdevelop the film. And we're going to push process it 1 stop. If you want to find out what developing time to use to process your film and push process it 1 stop, I would recommend that you consult the manufacturer's recommendation for the type of film that you're using and that developer. We are going to then, after we process normally and push process, we're going to process by underdeveloping, and that is called pull processing. We're going to underdevelop by 1 stop, and we're also going to consult the manufacturer's recommendations for this. The results of our film exposure variation test are in, and we can get 2 very good pieces of information from this test. One is that exposure controls density on the negative, and it controls it in a really important place, shadow detail. We can take a look at our contact sheets, and we can look at contact sheets rather than negatives because it's easier to get information. We're more used to looking at prints than we are negatives. And we can take a look in the shadow areas and look for the shadow detail that we want out of these 5 different exposures on each strip of film. We would pick the shadow detail that we like, and we would figure out how far that is from our normal exposure, and then we would rate our ISO of T-Max 100 accordingly. In other words, if it isn't the normal exposure, we're going to rate it at a different ISO, either higher or lower. The second piece of information is that contrast is controlled, overall film contrast that is controlled by development. And here we have 3 pieces of film, the contact sheets from 3 rolls of film. Each one of them developed differently. we can take a look at the overall scene contrast here, and we can pick out the overall contrast we like for the lighting situation. And that will be our development time. So what we're really doing is fine-tuning the film to our own personal needs. And you can do this with any film. You can also use this information from this test for other situations. You can use it for a non-normal lighting situation. For example, if we were photographing on an overcast day, no shadows, kind of flat lighting situation, and we want to induce some contrast. The way we can do that is by push processing. We can go ahead and take a look at our push process roll and see how much a one-stop push will affect the film contrast. Pick out the one-stop or the two-stop or maybe even a half a stop push and use that development time in that non-normal lighting situation.
The contact sheets show the actual exposure on the negatives and the contrast range for all three developments: normal, one-stop push, and one-stop pull. Dave now discusses contrast controls during black and white printing.
We're in the darkroom to talk about controlling contrast on the print. It's nice to be able to make images on film that have really good contrast, and we won't have to worry about anything other than a normal contrast control. However, there are times when you will want to use contrast control in the darkroom. There are two specific examples that I can think of. One is when you don't get that optimum negative that you're looking for, and you want to increase or decrease contrast in order to bring that negative into normal range. And the other is when you want to do something creative with the image and make it something that it's not from a more normal negative. For example, increase the contrast of a normal negative to a more high contrast print, or do the opposite, decrease a normal negative to make a flatter print through the use of contrast control. The main control of contrast is through the selection of paper type. And there are really several types of papers you could choose from. The first one is graded paper. And graded paper is the oldest and oftentimes the most sought after type of paper for really quality printing. It comes in paper grade numbers that range from 0 to 5. 0 being the lowest, or sometimes we call the softest contrast, and 5 being the highest, sometimes referred to as the hardest contrast. 2 and 3 numbers are usually assigned as the normal numbers that you would select for printing normal negatives, and the selection of 2 or 3 depends upon your personal preference and choice. Graded papers have the ability to give you the ultimate final result in print quality. The disadvantage to graded papers is you got to buy all 6 grades. That means you buy a box of 0, a box of 1, a box of 2, a box of 3. And some workers like to limit their boxes to the normal and 1 on either side, especially if they're making negatives under really controlled situations. There's a second type of paper that you might select in order to do your printing, and that is polycontrast paper. It's the most widely used and the most versatile of the 2 types of paper. Polycontrast paper is built a little differently. It comes in 2 emulsion layers. One of them is sensitive to green light, one of them is sensitive to blue light. Coupled with these 2 layers of emulsion are a set of filters. And in this Kodak polycontrast filter kit, we have the 2 extremes of filters, the 0 and the 5. The 0 is a yellow filter, and what it does is it eliminates most of the blue light from hitting the paper, causing the green light layer to give the most effect to the final print, and therefore resulting in a low contrast print. The 5 filter, on the other hand, is a deep magenta filter. And this deep magenta filter, when placed in the enlarger, absorbs a lot of the green light coming down to strike the paper and allows the blue light layer to be the main activated layer on the paper, thus giving a higher contrast to the paper. Well, you can see that these 2 numbers are very similar to the numbers on the graded paper system. The 0 is one extreme and the 5 is the other extreme on the polycontrast system. The only difference is this. that there is a half increment in between each whole number, giving you more control with polycontrast paper as far as contrast control goes. There are several different types of filters that you might use with polycontrast paper. The filters that I have in my hand here are the large acetate filters that are designed to go above the negative and below the light source. If I take one of these filters and place it in this Bessler enlarger that we have here, it would go in a special filter drawer made for the placement of these filters. The advantage of using these filters in the enlarger is that they're made of acetate. They're not optically sound, but they don't need to be. They can suffer some injury, some dust or dirt, possibly a scratch, and still give you a good quality print. The second type of filter is this smaller version, which comes in the same number system, and this smaller version fits underneath the lens. Now, because it fits underneath the lens in this filter drawer, this smaller version has to be optically sound. And any dust or dirt or fingerprints that are on this filter will have a negative impact on the print that you're trying to make. Because of polycontrast paper's unique construction, why we can do some things in the darkroom that we could not do otherwise. And that is that we can change the contrast of certain areas of the print because there's a double layer of emulsion. For example, let's take the typical landscape shot. If we had a scene with a horizon line and a very high contrasty sky, we could put in a yellow filter across the top. And then if we had a low contrast foreground that was maybe a little in shadow and the tones were getting kind of muddy, we could put this high contrast filter down below. We could merge the two and hide this merging in the horizon line so that we could actually print the paper with both of these filters under the enlarger light at the same time and giving us two different contrasts on the same sheet of paper. The other kinds of flexible things we can do with these polycontrast filters, we can use them for dodging and burning in local areas. I could take a filter and just wave it under the beam of the enlarger in one little area to change the local contrast. Or I could put it over the whole of a burning tool. I could put the selected filter over that and just burn in an area to either increase or decrease the contrast. And it just gives me an incredible range of options. Another choice we have for controlling contrast when we're printing is enlarger type. There are two basic types of enlargers, diffusion enlargers and condenser enlargers. The difference being that the diffusion enlarger, when printing a normal negative, will give you slightly less contrast than when you print that same negative on a condenser enlarger. The choice is yours, and it's really a choice of personal preference for each worker. This enlarger that I have here is very typical of the vast majority of enlargers on the market. This is a Bessler enlarger. It is a condenser enlarger. It has a light source up here. It has two lenses which are called condensers that take the light and intensify it as it passes through the negative, through the lens, and onto the easel. The second type of enlarger is a diffusion enlarger, and it's different from the condenser in that it has a much bigger box up on top. And usually color enlargers are typical of this type of enlarger. Color enlargers would have the knobs for dialing the colors in, and they will have a white mixing chamber inside of here instead of the condenser lenses. This causes the light to bounce around and come through the negative in a very soft form through the lens and onto the paper. The two basic types of enlargers, it's a good idea to look into which one suits your individual needs. We haven't covered everything there is to know about contrast control in the darkroom, but we have covered the basics. Paper and the type of filters and the type of enlarger that you use are all important qualities to getting a good print. However, the most important thing you can do is to get that image on film and get it right the first time. The contrast you put on film is what's going to determine the best quality in that final print.